Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and along with me today is the well-known apologist and debater and scientist, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. Jonathan, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, well, I've really liked your ministry for a while, even before we knew each other, and learned from you and enjoyed your approach on things. Enjoyed your call-ins to the atheist experience, where I know they're expecting you not to be what you are. So that was all great. But I'll tell you something I admire about you before we get into this discussion of your debate with cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor. One of the things that I've come to admire you really has more to do with the pastoral side of things. And that is that believers who are experiencing doubt and skeptics who are interested in becoming Christians or looking deeper into it, you have a ministry that you have created that is designed just for those kinds of people. And I've actually sent someone to it and they benefited from it. Can you just talk to us a little bit about your ministry, talk about doubts? We see it there on your baseball cap, but yeah, talk to us about that for a bit.
Absolutely. So I founded talkaboutdoubts.com in December. It's really a spin-off of something I've been doing privately on my personal website since 2016. And basically, at Talk About Doubts, we have assembled a team of more than 50 scholars, many of whom have advanced degrees, PhDs, and so forth, in different subjects such as astrophysics, molecular biology, biochemistry, physics, and so forth, biblical archaeology, New Testament studies, philosophy, psychology. And basically, we are a team that are willing to do one-on-one mentoring sessions with Christians who are struggling about their faith, as well as ex-Christians who want to explore whether there's a way back to faith and so forth. And so basically people fill out a form at the website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and then one of our team members will be in touch to set up a private one-on-one mentoring session with that person. And many of those have turned into, long-term mentoring relationships. And we've seen a lot of fruit from that. We've seen people, stabilized in their Christian faith. And we've actually got 3 people that are passing climbers who are now in our team at talkaboutdoubts.com. So,
that's great.
Really excited to see the fruit of that work. And we are also in the process of developing a emotional support group, which we're hoping to launch fairly soon for people that have reached out to us with questions. So really excited to do that sort of work. Been frustrated for a number of years watching many deconversion videos on YouTube, people that deconvert for at times not very well thought out reasons. And so I'm really passionate about equipping people and educating people about the evidence for Christianity and addressing people's intellectual concerns about the truth of the gospel.
Jonathan, it's a really great, slick website, and people can go there and actually see this litany of apologists that you have that are specialists in a variety of issues, or some all-purpose type people. My pastor, I was sharing it with him, and he was looking at it, and he said, Stephen Meyer is on here. And he said, what kind of a doubt do I have to say I have to get hooked up with Stephen Meyer? Maybe I don't think there's any scientific reason to believe in God or something. But no, what you're doing there is really amazing. There's a young lady in our community who I sent her your way, and she found great help there. So incredible resource. If you know anyone, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you got a friend who is struggling with issues related to worldview, contact Jonathan. Yeah. So, but what we have Jonathan on here for today specifically is Jonathan has now twice debated, I think it's only been twice, cosmic skeptic. Some people know him as Alex O'Connor. And this is one of my favorite atheist voices out there to think about what they're saying, to respond to, and a really sharp guy, a really brilliant guy, an enjoyable guy to listen to. He has a way with words. Alex does, and so does Jonathan. But I was actually supposed to debate Alex last year at Capturing Christianity. And so I'm very interested in him. I've spent a lot of time thinking about him and what he does. And this debate, I have to say, Jonathan, I don't mean to build it up too much for people, but I think this is my favorite debate of the past couple of years that I've seen related to God's existence. Have you had other people tell you that? Did you feel like this was a particularly special debate after you finished?
No, you're the first person that's said it's one of your favorite debates. So I'm honored that you think so. But yeah, I certainly enjoyed it very much. Alex is a very amicable guy. We spent the evening before the debate at his hotel room having dinner and just talking about what each other were going to be arguing and how we were going to be responding. And that's the way debate should be, because it allows you to have more focused discussion and when you kind of know where each other are coming from. And went out to the pub after the event, had him round for dinner the following night at our apartment. And yeah, I'm really impressed with Alex. He's not only a formidable intellect, but he's also a man of considerable character. And he even asked if we could pray before our meal when he was over for dinner, which is first time I've had an atheist over that that said that. So very
Why
likable
do you
guy.
think he asked that? Just so you would feel comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, he just didn't want us to feel like we had to do things differently because he was around. So
I love that, man. That's such a sweet guy. He is really, you could say about him as an atheist voice online, he is a friend to apologists. And I love that. So let's jump into this debate. Is there anything initial you just have to say about it before I ask you some questions or some sections of the debate that we're going to look through?
uh, no, I think that uh, it kind of went the way that I was expecting, and I think that Alex was expecting. I tend to focus mostly on, in terms of arguments from the natural sciences for the existence of God. I tend to focus more on the life sciences because that's my particular area of expertise, and I'm also interested in the case for Christianity in particular, because obviously an entailment of Christianity is that God exists. And so any evidence that bears directly on Christianity also bears on the probability of theism. So the way that I approached the debate was to argue from the arguments from the life sciences for design, in particular focusing on the genetic code and its fine tuning, as well as the replication of the DNA molecule and the irreducible complexity of that, and the information arguments and so forth. And then I also presented a nutshell version of the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And then he focused on what are his two favorite arguments, which are the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. So
Yeah, and I love this because in a lot of ways, this is like the old debates of the, let's say, 90s and 2000s that people like me and you would listen to when we listened to debates first getting into apologetics, and they would be live on stage debates. And they would often have some argument. It'd be a classical case. It'd be an argument for God's existence and an argument for the resurrection or some variation of that. And you did that. But the way you did it was I think appropriate to where we are right now. For example, you talked about the, and I may characterize some of this wrongly. I'm not a scientist, and it's important to say you actually are. I mean, you have a degree in evolutionary biology. That's important for people to know because we are in an arena where Christian apologists are often told, well, if you'd only understand science properly, you wouldn't believe any of this stuff. And so it's helpful to have someone like you who has those credentials. But on top of that, all of the people that are in my sphere who are talking about design type arguments right now, except for maybe like Luke Barnes, are talking about abiogenesis and first life. You've got like James Tour, you've got Cy Gart, you've got you all talking about this issue. Why do you think that is?
yeah, I think that the origin of life research is something which definitely points to design in every realm of experience. When we find information-rich systems, we uniformly and habitually associate that with conscious deliberation. And so finding information-rich systems is not particularly surprising on the supposition that a mind was involved. But on the other side of the coin, those sorts of systems are wildly surprising on the falsehood of that supposition that a mind was involved. And as origin of life research has progressed, the problem of explaining the origins of the first life has not become more tractable over time; it's become less tractable. And so the challenge to the naturalistic scenario with respect to the origin of life has become far more acute and far more apparent the more that we've understood about the origins of life. There's a reason why researchers struggle to get funding, because they're not making a lot of progress. The field is essentially at an impasse. And so I think that design is a far more plausible candidate hypothesis for explaining the origins of the first life.
Yeah, so let's. The reason I mention that is because the scientists that are speaking about this as who are also Christian apologists or Christian speakers, they're saying, some of them at least, are saying this is where you should be looking. And so, me as a non-scientist, I'm saying, okay, let's talk about it. And when I saw your presentation, and of course, I've read Stephen Meyer's two most popular books, and things like that. So I have a very loose understanding of how some of this stuff works, but I can grab on. But you did it in a succinct way. I encourage people. We're going to put in the links to this. We're going to have the link to Jonathan's channel, his YouTube channel, whatever else links he wants to give us, links to the ministry that he has about doubt, talk about doubts. And also this debate. And I want you to listen to what he does in this debate, because it doesn't take that long to get through this part of his opening statements. And it's very compelling and understandable. And I loved that you did that, because sometimes academics forget where the bottom shelf is to make it understandable to lay folks. So I love that. But let's go ahead and jump in. So you had brought basically this argument from the genetic information. And then you brought a case from, or you included in it your case from irreducible complexity, like Michael Behe type stuff. And for those that don't know, let's see if I can capture this, and then you can clean it up, Jonathan. Basically, irreducible complexity points to something where you have a machine of sorts, a biological machine, that if it had that the end goal, a lot of the component parts that are there in the end need to be there from the beginning, or else it couldn't have gotten to that point, or it wouldn't be functional at first. Clean me up, Jonathan.
Exactly. So basically, with an irreducibly complex system, you have a higher level function that is achieved by the cooperative working together of multiple subfunctions that all have to be there in order for that higher level objective to be realized. And so, if you were to remove any one of those components, you wouldn't have a system that worked half as well as it used to, or quarter as well as it used to, but would be broken. And intelligence is a cause which is able to uniquely visualize a complex end goal and then bring everything together that's needed to actualize that end goal. Whereas naturalistic type processes really struggle because natural selection can't visualize complex end goals. It can only work with what's currently selectable, what currently provides an advantage to the organism. And so when we're comparing those two alternative hypotheses, the intelligent design hypothesis and the naturalistic evolution hypothesis, I think that the intelligent design hypothesis has the better explanatory power to explain these sorts of features.
Yeah, I remember way back in the mid 2000s, you had, even in Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel, you had this discussion of irreducible complexity. And we remember the mousetrap example. For those that don't know, they say, and this came up in the debate. Jonathan presented it like this. A good analogy would be like a mousetrap, where you have the spring and you have the hammer and you have the the platform, and all these things have to be there in order for it to work. If you take one piece out, it doesn't really work. Now, I think in the debate, Alex did argue, well, I don't know about that. Maybe you could have a working mousetrap. But the point is, that's the idea. And the classic example I always saw pointed to was the bacteria flagellum motor that Behe always talked about. My understanding had been, and of course we're setting up these arguments that we'll discuss the rest of the debate a bit more briefly probably, but I want to make sure people understand what you presented. And so my understanding was that this irreducible complexity thing was just kind of not really a thing anymore, that we kind of had worked our way around it, that science had developed and we'd found answers. Is that wrong?
It is wrong. Yes. I think that there is merit to the argument from irreducible complexity, including, by the way, the bacterial flagellum. I don't think that the objections that have been made to that by Ken Miller, Nicholas Matsky, and others really stand up to scrutiny. I've written extensively on this subject at Evolution News and Science Today, for example. And I mean, we can talk about the bacterial flagellum if you want, or don't want to talk more about the DNA replication machinery. Where do you want me to go?
Well, is it safe to say that some of those examples are not as persuasive as they used to be, but some definitely are? Is that kind of where we're at?
No, I think that they're as persuasive, in fact, even more persuasive than they were when Behe published Darwin's Black Box. We actually know a lot more about these systems. And by the way, the type 3 secretion system, which was Ken Miller's go-to rebuttal to the bacterial flagellum, because as Ken Miller pointed out in finding Darwin's God, the flagellum, there's different flagella and different bacteria, of course, but in a standard bacterioflagellar motor that you might find in Salmonella or Escherichia coli, there's perhaps 40 different proteins, and if you were to remove 10 of them, you'd be left with a syringe called the type 3 secretion system, which is basically, it doesn't function as a flagellum, but it does inject poisons into multicellular organisms. Or Yersinia pestis, for instance, which causes bubonic plague, is equipped with a type 3 secretion system. And so the idea is, well, you could perhaps build on this simpler structure to produce a bacterial flagellum. But unfortunately for Ken Miller's argument, the subsequent research has now shown that the type 3 secretion system is not a precursor to the flagellum. Rather, it's an evolutionary degradation product of the flagellum. And there's a whole range of arguments that establish that. For instance, and it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective anyway, because there's an evolutionary pressure to be able to swim before there's an evolutionary pressure to inject poisons into multicellular organisms. And the phylogenetic evidence also suggests that the type 3 secretion system came later than the flagellum. Flagella are much more widely distributed, for example, than type 3 secretion systems. And also in the bacteria that have type 3 secretion systems but no flagella, there are nonetheless genes for making flagella, even if no flagella are assembled. And so these evidences cumulatively, and there's others as well, point to the conclusion that the type 3 secretion system came later than the flagellum. And then also you've got to put together the assembly apparatus, because flagellar motors, unlike man-made motors, actually assemble themselves. And so they have to be very specifically choreographed, because there's no point in starting to produce the propeller part of the motor until you put together the hook basal body apparatus. And so there's a transcription hierarchy that allows you to get the components being assembled in the appropriate order. And so it's not just simply a matter of borrowing components from here and there in a willy-nilly fashion. Yeah.
I don't know where I've heard this, but the thing that made this click for me initially years ago was someone mentioned that when you're on a plane, you are on a machine of which not one part flies. But when you get them all together, or at least enough together, you have a flying machine, but you had to have the whole apparatus there to begin with in order to have flight, as we understand it. And that's kind of the notion here, is there are certain machines, and we can call them machines, in your body that the whole thing had to be there in order to get us off the ground, basically, with this thing. And when you try to say, well, it developed over successive, mutations or whatever you say, the fact is, okay, but the way you would have to get there is if you're an intelligence knowing what the end game is, because the other things that lead to it aren't really helping with survival. The end thing is what we want. Is that a good way of expressing it?
Yeah, I mean, with the airplane example, there's a lot of redundancy, of course, in airplanes, because if one thing fails, you don't want the whole airplane falling from the sky, right? And so you have a lot of redundancy built in, and there's a lot of redundancy built into biology as well. I have a slightly tweaked version of how I would express irreducible complexity relative to the way that Behe did in Darwin's Black Box. So in Darwin's Black Box, Behe expressed irreducible complexity in terms of the number of structural components that have to be well matched one to the other to achieve this higher level purpose. Whereas I would define irreducible complexity not in terms of structural components, but rather in terms of the functions that need to be performed. Because unfortunately, when you define it in terms of structural components, that makes the argument more vulnerable to some of the objections that people like Ken Miller would want to put forward, because you could find other systems that lack that particular component that you were saying was essential in this organism, for instance. And you could have one function that's performed by two components, or you could have multiple functions be performed by the same component. But what needs to be what is irreducible are the number of functions that need to be performed. Even if the identity of that component or set of components performing that function can change, nonetheless, you have a certain minimal level of functions that need to be performed for that higher level function to be realized. And so that's the way that I prefer to express the argument.
I got you. Okay. All right. And then you brought a case for the resurrection, but you also mentioned a number of other Christian evidences. And it's kind of interesting, I think, for Christians who are kind of into worldview discussions like this, but not too deep. They're just used to hearing just the resurrection case and a very specific kind of resurrection case. When you put up on a whole PowerPoint slide, like 6 or 7 or 5 or 6 different things that support specifically the Christian God's existence, I found that pretty powerful. But you did specifically speak about the resurrection more than anything else, I guess. So, what differentiates your case, if there is a difference, from say like a Gary Habermas or Mike Licona type of approach?
Sure. So the way that I approach the resurrection case is to make what I call a maximal data argument, and that language comes from Lydia McGrew, who coined this idea of the maximal data approach to making the case for the resurrection. Basically, our critique of the minimal facts approach is that Habermas, as you know, defines a minimal fact as a fact which not only enjoys, in his assessment, good evidential support, but also enjoys support from more than 90% of historians across the theological spectrum.
And that's
And
also what Licona calls in his book a bedrock fact, I think.
exactly,
Mm-hmm.
right. And one of our concerns with that minimal facts approach is that when someone pushes Habermas on some alternative scenarios to try and explain the appearance fact, because the appearance it does qualify as a minimal fact by Habermas's criteria, he will respond typically by pointing out the implausibility of shared hallucinatory experiences, or perhaps making appeal to the multisensory character of the resurrection encounters. However, that takes him outside of his minimal facts criteria, because the group or shared experiences are not part of his minimal facts criteria. And certainly the polymodal or multisensory character of the resurrection encounters is not part of his minimal facts set, based upon his criteria. And so there's a little bit of a bait and switch going on, because he doesn't tell his audience that he's changed his criteria midway through the argument. So I prefer not to use the minimal facts approach. I also fear sometimes that he fails to distinguish in his analysis between a scholar that says that he's completely on board with this particular fact versus it's slightly more likely than not versus somewhat plausible. And so that's an important distinction that we also have to bear in mind when assessing whether scholars grant or don't grant a particular fact. I'm also less inclined than Habermas to repose the entire weight of my case, or the large chunk of my case, on 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Although that does carry evidential value, I think that where the real meat and potatoes is in the Gospels and Acts. I think sometimes the Habermas has a tendency to overstep what the evidence can justify when it comes to the dating of the oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. But in terms of the maximal data approach, which is the approach that I defend, basically we assert up front that the Gospels and Acts are actually based on the testimony of credible eyewitnesses. That is to say that they're written by individuals who are well informed, close up to the facts, and habitually scrupulous. And that can be defended and justified by appeals to both internal and extra-biblical corroborations from undecided coincidences, as well as incidental allusions in the Gospels that are corroborated by extra-biblical sources, and various other lines of evidence as well. If that is the case, which I think that we can defend very well, then it stands to reason then that the claims in the Gospels and Acts concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus actually reflect the testimony of purported eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And so we have to try to explain, okay, why are they making these claims? And when anyone makes any sort of claim, there are three and only three broad categories of explanation for why they're making that claim. And this holds true for whether we're talking about a sexual assault allegation or witness to a miracle or whatever it happens to be. And these are that the individual is lying about it, or they're honestly mistaken, or they're in fact correct. These are mutually exhaustive. And when we look at the content of the apostolic claim that we find in the Gospels and Acts, we find that they are multisensory in nature. They involve multiple sensory modes. We're not just talking about individual sightings from a distance and very briefly. Rather, we're talking about group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, eating broiled fish with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, long discourses, physical contact. It's, according to Acts 1, it's extended across a 40-day time period. So it's not just a brief, confusing episode. And so that's the sort of set of claims that's very difficult to be honestly wrong about. And so then that redistributes the probabilities between our two remaining options, namely that they're correct or they lied. And when you look at the context of the apostolic testimony, we find that they proclaimed the resurrection under very dangerous conditions, very dangerous circumstances. In fact, the apostles voluntarily endured sufferings and labors and dangers and hardships and toils and persecutions, and in some cases martyrdom, for their testimony that Christianity was true, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And so that is surprising if they're just making stuff up deliberately, but not hugely surprising if, in fact, their testimonies, they're at least sincere in holding to that testimony. And so, having shown the implausibility of those two competing explanations, then we in turn redistribute the probabilities such that the hypothesis that God in fact raised Jesus from the dead becomes the most probable explanation of the relevant facts.
Right on. And so you presented this case. I think that exhausts your case, what we've just discussed. And then we got into the responses. Now, what Alex brought, and by the way, we've already said this, but really love Alex. So anything I say that sounds critical, trust me, I have great respect and admiration for Alex in a lot of ways. So here he brings a hiddenness case or a hiddenness argument and says, hey, look, what Schellenberg and all these others are looking for is, or what they're saying is, what you shouldn't have is non-resistant non-belief if such a God of love who wants relationship exists. Because if you're non-resistant and you're open to a relationship, if God would only reveal himself, God so designed or so described seems to want to do that. So what gives is kind of the case there. And he also brought the point that, hey, look, if this is true, if God exists, and let's say it's the Christian God, why does it seem to be geographically such that only people born in a certain space, or predominantly people born in a certain area at a certain time, are likely to receive this message or accept this message? And then lastly, he brought an evidential argument, kind of the gratuitous suffering type thing, and focused not so much on big displays of evil like the Holocaust or something, but more on issues like stubbing your toe or dealing with a mild sickness, let's say, something like that. Like, even if God wants to have those big events of suffering, some of them need to be there because they're going to influence the world. Maybe, I think he even maybe said, or maybe you did, maybe the Holocaust, he allowed that to happen because the lessons learned from that would prevent 10 more Holocausts that are bigger or something. So, but then why these little things like stubbing my toe? Why that sort of thing? And that's kind of the case that he brought. Does that sound like fairly I've covered basically what he presented?
Yeah, essentially that's right. In particular, on the hiddenness argument, he would bring up the idea of non-resistant non-believers, which is John Schellenberg's phrase. But yeah, that's essentially encapsulates what he argued.
Yeah, and it's important to say about that. Well, if it's not obvious from the name of a non-resistant non-believer, we're talking about someone who is not saying, if a God did exist, I wouldn't worship it, or I don't want to believe that it exists, or I'm too biased, or anything like that. We're talking about someone who, at least this is part of the problem, is they're professing that they are genuinely open and looking for God, as Alex is. And Alex, I have to say, I would tell people to listen to the first of Alex's opening statement, because he said something great there. He said, look, I know that there's skepticism. This is not like a quote, but basically the notion was, I recognize that there is this compulsion among Christians because of certain Bible passages to think that there aren't really any actual atheists, that I'm just in rebellion and all these kind of things. But I'm telling you, not only was I an altar boy, not only did I go to like a Catholic school or something, I actually live with Christians because I want to know if in the daily life of living with Christians, I pick it up, through osmosis or something. I've looked at all the evidence. I've gone to get a degree in theology. I mean, that does sound pretty powerful, Jonathan, yeah, he has, it seems like he's tried almost every way one can. What do you say to something like that?
Yeah, so on the problem of non-resistant non-believers, I think it's one thing to concede that there are non-resistant non-believers. I think that there probably are, and I'm inclined to take Alex at his words that he sincerely would become a Christian if he were persuaded that Christianity is true. However, I think that it's another thing to argue that there are long-term non-resistant non-believers. If someone is a non-resistant non-believer at time t, then it might simply be the case God's not finished with them yet. And I trust that God will give people the evidence that they need. I see this world as probation. This is an idea that was put forward by Joseph Butler in his Analogy of Religion, one of my intellectual heroes. And part of one form that this probation in this life can take is to test whether we are willing to conduct the investigation that's necessary to give ourselves a fair and balanced assessment of the available evidence. I am convinced that the existence of God is obvious from the created world. I'm in full agreement with the Apostle Paul in Romans 1, verse 20, where he says that God's attributes, his power, divine qualities are clearly perceived from what has been made, so that men are anapologetus, or without an apologetic, without an excuse. I think that the existence of God is obvious, is manifestly apparent in the created order. And that being the case, then it renders it non-obvious that there's nothing to the Christian claim. And so I think that it renders it incumbent upon us to investigate the truth claims of the gospel, even almost to the same extent that it would be the case if one was very nearly convinced of the gospel's truth. And so I think that the God's manifest the evidence that exists in nature for the existence of God renders it incumbent upon us to investigate the truth claims of the gospel.
Jonathan, when you said that in the debate, and there was something later that made me back off of this, but initially my question was, hold on, I get what you're saying, and of course I think so. I think that there's enough at stake that one should investigate this to the best of their abilities and try to find the truth. But why the Christian faith? Why not all world faiths? And wouldn't that result in a research project that is would be continuing indefinitely?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the three monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, are really the only serious contenders in terms of, they're at least the only ones that attempt to put forward a positive evidential case for their veracity. And Islam, I think, turns out to be false on a very light inspection. Islam, I think, turns out to be incorrect. Muhammad was a false prophet, and there's a whole range of problems
Amen.
with the Quran and Islam that are very easy to stumble upon. So, and then in terms of Judaism, I think that Judaism points to Christianity and points to the gospel. I think that the argument for messianic prophecy is compelling. And so if Judaism is true, then I think that Christianity also has to be true as well, because either Jesus is the Jewish Messiah or nobody is. And if nobody is, then that's the problem for Judaism. So, and I think that the case for Christianity is extremely compelling, especially when you start to dig into the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts and how that bears on the case for the resurrection. And as you said earlier, I have at least 6 different lines of argument that I would deduce for Christianity: the resurrection, the trilemma argument, messianic prophecy, the conversion of the Apostle Paul, the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds, and contemporary miracles. And it's not necessary for me to show that any of those arguments taken individually on its own is sufficient to justify Christian belief, but rather taken in aggregate, they are, in my judgment, as sufficient to render the case essentially conclusive.
Yeah. Um, I find that interesting. Let me ask you something, and this is going to be kind of like the Israel, the survival of Israel as a nation sort of thing. This, I don't want to get too far afield, but when I think in my own head about reasons I believe, okay, obviously I have the litany of things that come to us from the world of Christian philosophy and philosophy of religion and all that kind of thing. But specifically, one thing is interesting to me. I think about, and I'm not the first to say it; others have said it, but I wonder what you think about it. So, if one already believes in God, so they're a theist, but they're just struggling with, why should I believe that Christianity is true? Well, you could take one of those routes that you listed. One thing you could do is to just note that, hold on, if we're saying that theism is true, and let's say that theistic arguments get us to a God very consistent with the Christian and Jewish God, and is and would likely want to communicate with man, like would likely want to interact with us. I don't think it takes much to get there. Now, if that's true, and we look around for where that may have happened in human history, I think you make a good point that I've made before, which is for reasons that we could get into, but that aren't hard to give. I think we land on the 3 great monotheistic religions, and then of those 3, like you just said, there happens to be a guy right in the, I said, hey, guy, that sounds not very reverent, but there happens to be a guy right in the middle of those three who claims to be that. And he never wrote anything down so far as we know. He never traveled far from where he lived, but there's more statues to him than anybody else. And it's changed the world. It's changed the way we think. It's changed so much that just seems like a pretty powerful reason to think so. Just if you can start with, I believe there's a God and he would want to communicate with man. What do you think about that kind
Absolutely.
of a presentation?
Absolutely, I completely agree with what you just said. And as you said, it's striking that Jesus is at the heart of those three major Abrahamic faiths: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I think that obviously a lot of Orthodox Jews wouldn't recognize Jesus even as a prophet, but certainly I think that the Old Testament points to Jesus as the ultimate Messiah. Just read, for instance, Isaiah 53. Which I think is it's certainly written centuries before Jesus' time, and I think it describes in great detail the messianic mission, which really only fits Jesus. And notice also that the Messiah, according to Isaiah 53, 1 and 2, was supposed to be rejected by his own people, and yet, according to Isaiah 42, 6 and Isaiah 49, 6, was supposed to bring representatives of all nations to recognition of the God of Israel. He's supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, that God's salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Now, who has accomplished that except for Jesus? No one has accomplished that. And yet that's something that's, if Jesus really is the Messiah, that's highly expected, that's highly probable based upon these Old Testament passages. What's the likelihood, though, that some messianic claimant is going to be rejected by his own people, the Jews, and yet nonetheless bring representatives of all the nations to recognize the God of Israel? That's quite surprising. And so it might not be sufficient to justify Christian belief, but it does move the needle in that direction. And then Jesus, of course, is a central figure in Islam as well. Jesus is mentioned more times in the Quran than Muhammad is mentioned. He's a very, very prominent prophet in Islam. And the Quran, of course, makes the claim that Jesus certainly was not God, and he was not crucified, as we learn in Surah 4, verse 157 and 158. And so if we can show historically that Jesus actually claimed divine status and actually was crucified, not only was crucified, but he actually prophesied ahead of time his impending death and subsequent resurrection from the dead, then that's a serious headache for Islam. Certainly, if Jesus prophesied his death, then one of two things is true. Either he died by crucifixion, in which case he's a true prophet, but Islam is false because it says that he wasn't killed by crucifixion, or he wasn't killed by crucifixion, in which case he's a false prophet because he falsely predicted that he would be, in which case Islam's also false. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. Pick your poison.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, since we solved all that, now we've demonstrated that Christianity is true. But let's go on here. So now when he brought that hiddenness case, one of your responses, and I've heard this from people before. I've never used this response, but you did. But you just kind of mentioned in passing that, okay, when it comes to hiddenness, like God's not as obviously real or present or whatever as some people would like him to be. Like, why doesn't he at least show up every few years in Jerusalem or at the White House lawn or in every country or whatever, and do a press conference? Hey, I'm still here just in case anyone wants to know. And one of the reasons you give is, okay, and it relies a little bit on a belief in middle knowledge, I think, at least as possibly true. And that is that if God knows what people would choose if given certain type of evidence, God's not required to give people more evidence than he knows should be compelling or convincing to them if he knows they're not going to believe anyway. I've said that. The thing I haven't said is that perhaps God doesn't wish to increase their culpability for not worshiping him because he's giving them so much more evidence. It should be more obvious to them. And so maybe he wouldn't give so much extra evidence when he knows it won't convince them anyway. Is that basically a fair characterization?
Exactly. So Scripture never commends the idea of simply believing that God exists. It's not that God is sitting up in heaven just desperate to be believed in. Rather, it's submission to God, repentance and saving faith and so forth, and entering into genuine, authentic relationship with God. And that the latter, not the former, is the virtuous thing that Scripture commends to us. And so if Scripture also teaches that people are judged in accord with the light that they have been given. And so if God was to give people more evidence, knowing full well that they are going to reject relationship with him anyway, what's he done? He's just made them more culpable and therefore subject to greater condemnation. And so it could actually be seen as an act of mercy, at least in the case of some individuals, for God to withhold from them more evidence that would increase their culpability and thus their guilt. And so that's one possible perspective
Well, before you go on,
on that.
Jonathan, there's a couple of things I could see someone saying in response to that. For example, Dillahunty said in my debate with him, he said, well, at least, because I made that point, he doesn't just want people to believe that he exists. He wants people to believe on him, enter into a relationship with him in that way. And Dillahunty says, yeah, but at least we could get past this pedantic discussion about whether this entity exists at all. But of course, as you're saying now, that's not even the point. The point isn't to at least get everyone to believe that he exists. The point is to get as many people as, to get as many people as will to enter into a trusting, repentant relationship with Jesus. And it may be that the means God uses to accomplish that goal may have fewer people believing in terms of mental assent, but more people coming to faith in Christ or something, depending on how it all shakes out. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think that there is some merit to the idea of divine middle knowledge, that God puts people in places and circumstances where they will get the optimum amount of evidence that will correspond to whether God's foreknowledge of that individual, whether they were going to accept or reject him anyway, in light of that evidence or lack thereof.
Yeah, and I guess I should correct what I said. So I guess it would be better to say, if you had a situation where God appearing regularly or whatever did result in, let's say, the vast majority of humans believing that he exists, right? Okay, well, then you'd have more people believing that God exists than people entering a relationship with him. But it may be that you would have more people entering into a relationship with him when he doesn't do that than if he did expose himself in such a way that it was really beyond question whether he exists. I think that's a
Right.
fair way, to
Yeah,
characterize
I
that.
think it is. I think it is, and also, if this world, if this life is intended to be a probation, then if God is constantly showing up, say God was always before our face or something like that, and he was always at the forefront of our consciousness, then that could undermine the ability of this life to serve as a probation, because it would be far less easy to suppress the knowledge of God, and therefore it would impede our moral decision making and our character building that we that we do in this lifetime.
All right, real quick before we go on, I just want to say that I'm going to be sending out a link on our YouTube community tab just shortly today that is going to give people who are listeners of this show access to a webinar that I'm not hosting, that is being hosted by Logos Bible Software. And if you are a viewer of this show and you go there and you have any interest in any Logos Bible Software product, you're going to get a 30% discount or 20%. You're going to get a chunk of a discount if you attend this free webinar that they're doing in conjunction with Trinity College and Seminary this Friday night at, I think it's at 7. So be watching the community tab. I'm going to post that shortly. Let's get back to this, though, Jonathan. So now he did respond to what you just said. Well, not that exactly. There are people who say, well, William Lane Craig has said, well, but a God who advertises his existence so obviously, so commonly, so often could actually be repulsive. I mean, after all, everyone believes Donald Trump exists, but there's a whole lot of people that don't want anything to do with him. But he seemed to anticipate that sort of a response and reply by saying he doesn't have to be there all the time. He just can show up occasionally. But your point here, I think, would still stand, which is that would strip us of that privation that you're talking about, or that probation, I guess, of experiencing the evils of this world or whatever such. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, so as I said, I think that this life is a probation, that we are in this moral choice arena where we regularly engage in moral decision making. We mold and shape our character in morally significant ways, and that this is intended as a test and as a character building exercise. This life in which we now live, and that being the case, uh, I think God has done well in striking the optimal balance between making his existence and reality sufficiently accessible that anyone that seeks after God will, in the long run at least, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported. But the person that wants to suppress that knowledge and make poor choices in this life, and poor moral choices, is also free to do that, because God isn't so abundantly obvious that he's always at the forefront of our consciousness. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's another point, this long-term non-resistance thing that you brought out. I really want people to catch that, because the atheists will often respond with saying, "Oh, hey, okay, you threw Romans 1:20 at me, and you throw the suppressed. You think I'm suppressing the truth and everything, so you think I'm lying to you, basically." And the response with this in mind would be something like, say, "No, I don't think you're lying. I don't think you're being disingenuous. I just think if you stay in a situation where you're not lying, you're not being disingenuous, and you're really looking at the evidence, given enough time in such a state with the right heart and attitude toward this situation, you will come to see at least that Christianity is true, whether you accept it or not." Right?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go
So
ahead if you have anything else to say about that.
yeah, we're not saying that the non-believer is being irrational, or that they're ill-informed necessarily in their rejection of Christianity. Rather, we're saying that you cannot be both rational and fully informed in the long run and continue to reject Christianity.
So that makes me think of William Rowe's famous paper, Some Variety, or let's see, The Evidential Argument from Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism. And toward the end, he says, there are unfriendly atheists, there are friendly atheists. And he characterized a friendly atheist as someone who says that theists are justified. Even if they're wrong, they're justified in holding the positions that they do, because they may have good reasons, like theistic arguments or whatever, that are convincing to them. Are you saying that unfortunately you can't be a friendly theist in that same way, in that you would say, after living your life, let's say on your deathbed, hypothetically, if you have investigated and understood all of the reasons to believe in the Christian God, you cannot be rational and still believe that the Christian God does not exist? Is that your position?
Exactly. My position is that if you are fully informed and you're doing your best to be as rational and objective and impartial with the evidence as possible, you will, in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported.
Yeah, and you say something great here that I really want to underscore. This is one of the two of my favorite things. This is one of them. And it was, you said on this point about general revelation, discovering evidence for God is not hard. It's been made artificially hard by bad scholarship and poor standards that insist that the simplest answer cannot actually be the correct answer. That made me think of the number of times that people have told me that well, if God's existence is so obvious, or if everyone's supposed to accept it, well, then why do we have these big, robust philosophical arguments and historical cases and scientific inferences? Why can't it be more accessible? And it seems like what you're saying here is what I've said many times. It really is the case that you can walk outside, look around, and it's obvious. And it's been obvious to most people in the history of the world that at least some sort of God or gods exist. It seems like this thing where you have to have a PhD, because there have been arguments brought against what we're saying. And then we have to deal with those arguments, and then counter arguments are brought. And we deal with those, and it gets into the weeds. Is that basically what you're saying?
Exactly. One doesn't have to be first confused by a bad objection and then unconfused by the solution to that bad objection in order to have been rational in the first place. Darwin said that, Richard Dawkins said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And what he means by that is that prior to Darwin, and his publication, The Origin of Species in 1859, it was widely taken for granted that there was a God. And one of the number one reasons that people had for thinking that there was a God was the complexity of biological systems. And then Darwin, of course, came along, and allegedly he provided a way that you could explain the appearance of design without recourse to an actual designer, namely natural selection and chance variation. Of course, didn't know what mutations were at the time. But now, if Darwin got it wrong, as I think he did, then we're back to where we were before Darwin. And actually, the problem or the challenge to naturalism has become far more exacerbated since the time of Darwin because of the modern advances in the life sciences. We now understand the information basis of biology, and we now understand the prevalence of molecular machinery in the cell and irreducible complexity and so forth. And so the challenge to naturalism is far greater now than it was in the days of Darwin. We're far more without an excuse, without an apologetic than we were before Darwin. And so Darwin just gets in the way with his bad scholarship. And I'm also including in that the modern perspectives on Darwinism, the new and extended syntheses and so forth. Obviously, I understand that biology has moved a long way since Darwin, but I think that the idea that natural selection can be the fundamental explanation behind biological complexity that explains away the appearance of design without recourse to an actual designer, I think that is fundamentally flawed, and therefore when we look at life and we see the designoid features of the world, our intuitions are actually correct. They're actually telling us the way the world actually is. So these are not just, it's not just the appearance of design, we're actually looking at authentic design that points to an intelligent creator. And so we just have to get into the weeds and respond to the bad scholarship, which is Darwinian biology. But
and you can see what Dawkins
it makes it artificially more difficult than it ought to be.
Yeah, you can see what Dawkins is referring to, though, because if you look pre-Darwin at the characters that pop up in these discussions who you would expect to be atheist or agnostic or something, they're often deists. And then after Darwin, you see more characters that are recognizable as atheists or something we're used to today. So I thought that was a really powerful statement there. Discovering evidence for God is not hard. It's been made artificially hard. And then, he had brought, so your response to his general evidential argument, it was, simply to say, so he's kind of taking Rowe's approach, of saying, okay, and with an evidential argument, what we're saying is not that it's impossible that God has some reason for why he might allow this. It's just really unlikely given the existence of particularly gratuitous evil, which we mean evil that doesn't seem to serve some greater purpose or greater good. There's nothing redeeming about it. It's just senseless suffering. And how did you respond to that? Because I thought it was beautiful in its simplicity and elegance.
Yeah, so basically I gave two responses on the problem of evil. First of all, I do think that it is evidence that contributes to the case for atheism and against theism. I do think that it is of some evidential value there. But I do think that people have a tendency to overstate how strong that evidence is in disconfirming theism. And one of the reasons for that is because people, when they think about the problem of evil, are often very impressed with the sheer number of cases that we have of apparently gratuitous suffering in the world. And one point that often gets missed is that instances of evil in the world are not epistemically independent. So to show what I mean by that, consider the first instance of suffering that we discover in the world. And let's suppose hypothetically that it has a base factor of 100, just simply meaning that it's 100 times more likely that evidence would exist on atheism than it does on theism. And so it tends to confirm atheism over theism. It doesn't necessarily follow that the second instance of suffering in the world actually carries the same evidential value or weight as the first one did. Because if God has the morally sufficient justification, no matter how unexpected, for that first instance of evil, he may well have a similar morally sufficient justification for the second one, and so and the third one, and the fourth one, and so forth. And so with each successive example, the evidential value actually declines or depreciates over time. And so you can't just keep adding successive examples and expect the case to continue to grow in strength. This is the problem of diminishing returns by multiplying examples. So that's the first point. Notice by contrast, by the way, that when we consider the cumulative case for theism, we not only have extensive evidence, but the evidence also varies in kind. We're not just talking about lots of examples of essentially the same thing. We're talking about multiple discipline, an interdisciplinary case with multiple categories of evidence, that all point in the direction of theism and indeed Christianity more particularly. So that's the first point about the problem of evil. Second point is what I like to call the problem of evidential entanglement, which is to say that the problem of evil requires that you have conscious subjective experience. You cannot suffer and you cannot perpetrate evil unless you have conscious subjective experience. And conscious subjective experience, as Richard Swinburne and others have shown, is far, far more probable on the supposition of theism than on its falsehood. Think of all the preconditions that are necessary for embodied consciousness. You need a universe governed by physical laws such as gravity, and not just any old universe, but a finely tuned universe. You need the origins of life. You need the origins of molecular machines inside the cell. You need the origins of multicellularity, and you need the origins of developmental pathways and complex body plans and organs and tissues and complex brains. And then finally, you might get conscious experience. And that all of these things have been traditionally used as points of leverage in arguments for theism rather than against it. And so having conscious experience in the world is not hugely surprising on the supposition of theism, but it's wildly surprising on its falsehood. And therefore, evil and suffering is highly surprising whether you're a theist or an atheist, which are, of course, two mutually exhaustive worldviews. And so that's also a factor that needs to be taken into account, that you can't simply divorce the problem of evil from the evidential case that tends to point in confirmation of theism. It's a problem both for the atheist as well as for the theist.
Yeah, because it's obviously a problem for the theist for obvious reasons. It's a problem for the atheist, though, because it's a problem that we got to a state where something like suffering is even a possibility, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, listen, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but there are a couple more things that I'd like to hit on. His response to your issue, your scientific cases, particularly the one that has to do with first life and genetic information. He didn't respond to it by saying, well, no, actually, here's the case I would present to counter that. And we wouldn't expect him to. He doesn't have the same training as you do. But he did say, well, it seems like you're anticipating there will never be a Newton for this particular issue. We have these big unknowns throughout history, perhaps what Darwin did, perhaps Newton, perhaps Copernicus, I don't know, whatever. And we have these characters that come along and figure something out. And then things kind of drop into place and you just kind of stand back and go, oh, well, that's amazing, but there's the answer right there. And he's saying, why shouldn't we expect that would happen with abiogenesis and genetic information? Right? That's basically the...
Yeah, so it's basically saying that take a well, let's wait and see approach, which in no other discipline do we do this. I mean, imagine if you were, imagine a court scene, right, where you've got a defendant who's in the witness stand, and he's been presented with all of the fingerprint evidence and other forensic evidence, DNA evidence, blood spatter analysis, fabric analysis, and so forth. And all of that evidence is presented before him, and all of it cumulatively points to the verdict of guilty. And the defendant says, well, you don't know. I mean, there could be more evidence coming, 10 years down the line that will vindicate me and show that I'm in fact innocent and actually explain away all this evidence that seems to point to me being guilty. Well, would we on that basis say, okay, then I guess the defendant can go scot-free because we can't rule out the possibility that 10, 15 years down the road, there'll be further evidence that comes to light that reveals that he's in fact innocent after all. Well, no, we have to work with the evidence that's currently available to us. And as it turns out, with the sorts of evidences that I had used in terms of the origins of genetic code, information content in the cell, fine-tuning of the genetic code, the origins of DNA replication, and so forth, the problem has become more acute the more that we've understood, not less acute. It's become more difficult to explain on naturalistic terms than previously. And so I don't hold out optimism that the design inference is going to be undercut by further scientific research.
Yeah, it's Here's a question. I don't know if I mentioned to you before we started, but as I listened to this with Alex, and I've watched some of the videos that he's released recently. Famously, maybe it was last year now, he mentioned that he no longer likes to use the lack theist definition of atheism or something like that. It's clear that as he's gone through his theological education and whatever else is going on, he has evolved in his use of certain arguments or terms, I think. And I just kind of wonder, I mentioned that this debate reminded me more like the debates of the early 2000s when you had some Christian scholar on one side and some atheist scholar on the other. And you didn't get a lot of sometimes you did, but you didn't get a lot of the new atheist talking points. And I've kind of wondered if, as Alex has evolved as a thinker and done away with some of those new atheist type talking points, if it has actually made his case where he has less tools to use. And so it becomes more clear to viewers, and maybe this is a bias statement, that the strength of the Christian position. What do you think? Is that overreaching?
Well, certainly, I think that Alex has grown more sophisticated over the years since he started his YouTube channel. This is one of the areas, by the way, in which I really greatly admire Alex, is that he's not afraid to come forward and say, hey, I was wrong about this argument or that objection from years gone by. And he even has done videos where he will debunk his old self, giving a critique of the cosmological argument. I also really appreciate about Alex that he's like, for instance, we were having a conversation the night before the debate at his hotel, and I said that I wasn't a huge fan of the ontological argument. And he was saying, what, you don't like the ontological argument? And then he starts putting forward the ontological argument and saying, actually, this is an argument that troubles him, that he thinks that it actually has more merit to it than I give it credit for. And um, so, yeah, it's an argument that he was willing to defend, even though he disagrees ultimately with the conclusion. But he thinks that it actually has some merit as an argument
He
for
likes it.
the existence. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, so this is one thing I really appreciate about Alex, is that I think that he embodies the scout mindset of someone that actually wants to find out where the truth is. And Alex is one of the people that whom I've debated that I would really hold out hope for that he actually does become a Christian at some point. I'd really love to see him converted and come to Christ. I think that the evidence is there, and I think that he's sufficiently objective that if he studies it in detail, I think that he could in principle be swayed by it. I certainly hold out more hope for him being swayed than someone like a Matt Dillahunty or someone like that. So,
Yeah.
but you're right. I really appreciate how Alex is willing to change his mind on some of the arguments that he's used in the past. Like he even mentioned that he disagreed now with some objections from his previous debate with me that he did back in Oxford. So he certainly makes a lot of progress intellectually, and I really admire him for that.
Yeah. So let's just hit some of these real quick that that came up. And then we'll just kind of let you go because I know you have a school that you teach at and everything else. Um, yeah, he brought up in the future. We already talked about this a bit. We can imagine people kind of looking back and saying, "Of course, they didn't yet." It's hard to imagine they didn't yet have an answer for the genetic information. I was actually surprised. Were you? I mean, I guess you guys talked about what you were going to say. I was kind of surprised he went that direction. Do you think it's just because? I would have to do something similar in his position because I don't know the science. Is that what you think was going on there?
So say that again. Which direction you move with the
I,
genetic code?
I was surprised to hear him say about the scientific data that you presented, the
Mm-hmm.
whole, naturalism of the gaps almost like later we'll figure this
Yeah.
out. Were you surprised by that? And do you think the reason he did that was just because, I mean, I kind of have to respond to this somehow, and I'm not a scientist. I can't compete with him on that issue. Why do you think he did that? Do you think that's really the best response?
Yeah, that might be the reason. I find the God of the Gaps objection or the let's wait and see objection to be the weakest form of objection to those arguments um, for reasons that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, that could well be the reason. I certainly think that Alex isn't an expert in those areas, of course, and so, um, but he's also not an expert on the fine tuning and those sorts of things either. So yeah, I think it's probably the best that he could do with his limited background knowledge.
Well, now, didn't he say something like, yeah, he said something like resurrect. This is not, again, not a quote. Resurrection might be the best explanation if theism is true. But in a debate on that issue, you can't presume that. To a naturalist, this sounds like a less likely explanation than another. So you all were talking about the resurrection, and he's saying, okay, if God exists, perhaps God is the best explanation for the resurrection of Jesus. But you're having a debate with me, Jonathan, on whether or not, or whether naturalism or theism is the best account or whatever. And so you can't just presume that there's a God to have raised Jesus from the dead. That's how I understood him going with that.
Yeah, Alex makes that objection. I don't find it very convincing. There are also Christians that argue like this as well. Classical apologists, that's kind of the distinguishing factor of a classical apologist versus an
Right.
evidentialist apologist. And I don't buy that, because the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is itself supported by the evidence that bears on Jesus having been raised from the dead. And so if we're adducing evidence that God raised Jesus from the dead, that itself amounts to an argument for the existence of God. Now, you might say that because it doesn't follow from a lack of independent demonstration that God exists, that the prior probability of God performing a miracle in Jesus' case is zero, right? Because a lack of independent demonstration of God's existence does not entail that God does not exist. And
But you
so,
would admit it'd be higher, right? If everyone on the
yeah,
table already, yeah, okay,
right.
go ahead.
So an independent argument for theism, say from the biological arguments or the fine tuning and so forth, would be relevant positively to the prior probability of God raising Jesus from the dead. Although it would only be, in my view, minimally relevant, because I think that there's an asymmetry such that the case for God's existence is only minimally relevant to the prior probability of God raising Jesus from the dead, whereas the evidence bearing on Jesus being raised from the dead is very much relevant to the case for theism. So Lydia McGrew gives this analogy, which is, imagine that we hypothesize that a random individual exists. Let's call them Braxton, right? And let's suppose that we take the hypothesis that Braxton exists. And what relevance does that play to the prior probability, to our assessment of the prior probability that Braxton will send me an email tomorrow afternoon? Well, it is relevant somewhat, but it's not particularly relevant. It doesn't raise the prior probability that I'll receive an email tomorrow from Braxton that much. Whereas if I do in fact receive an email from someone claiming to be Braxton tomorrow, that's much more relevant to our assessment of the prior probability that this individual called Braxton exists. And so that's kind of the way I would argue with respect to the resurrection. And as I also pointed out, you can raise the prior probability of God raising Jesus from the dead by adducing other arguments that bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as the argument from the trilemma and messianic prophecy and the conversion of Paul and so forth.
But I guess what I'm asking is like, okay, so, well, just to familiarize people real quick, if you get a book like Five Views on Apologetics from Zondervan's Counterpoint series or something, you're going to see two apologists, one a classicalist, in that case, William Lane Craig, and one an evidentialist, in that case, Gary Habermas. And of course, a lot of times when you hear someone say evidentialist, it's used in a different, it's like presuppositional apologists saying about anyone who's not a presuppositionalist, they're an evidentialist. But there actually are two positions, if you want to subcategorize classical and evidential. The only real difference being, as he said, that the evidential apologist, at least typically, is going to just present some reason to believe that God or that Jesus rose from the dead or that Jesus is divine in some way. Whereas the classicalist is going to have a two-step approach, show that God exists and then show that Jesus rose from the dead or is divine in some way. But that brings me to the question that I'm still not clear on. Why didn't you just say, I just gave you an argument or two for God's existence?
I don't remember what it said, but if I didn't say that, I should have said that.
Yeah, that's it. Well, you gave the answer why you don't think you have to or whatever. But I mean, even if we granted him that, it's like I just gave you one, So, but in any case,
Sure, yeah.
yeah. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, there's not really much else we need to discuss here. One thing that we did talk about with this menial suffering, we talked about that, didn't we, on the recorded show? So I really think, is there something else you wanted to say about that?
No, I think that what I said in the debate is sufficient. I think that pain, including menial pain, like stubbing our toes, is a danger response. It's supposed to alert us to danger, and so eliminating that from the world, I think, would have negative consequences. I always love it when atheists think that they have a way of designing the world better than God. I mean, how many universes have we tried to design?
Right. Right. It's like a lot of people, it's like back to the issue of Christianity impacting the whole world and skeptics saying, well, hold on, if there really was a God, that's not how he would have done it. If he wanted to get the best result, he would have done it this way in the modern day with cameras and all that. And I'm thinking, yeah, but like it did work. Like it almost looks like, no, this is how a God who's omniscient might spin this thing because he knows in this way, it may be unexpected to other people who would be trying to plan this. I mean, I think you and I would look at God. I mean, assuming that we didn't know what we think we know about God being omniscient and all those kind of things, we might say to God, God, you sure you want to do it in this backwater country and, in this place at this time with a guy who's never going to write anything down? It's like, no, just trust me. And sure enough, it impacts the entire world and impacts the thinking of the world and all the rest. But yeah, well, he brought up this thing about Paul. And Paul perhaps having a guilt hallucination or something. This is something I've heard Richard Carrier bring up before, that it has something, it sounds like conversion syndrome or conversion disorder, right? Where I've been persecuting a group of people and suddenly I have this mental break and perhaps there's a hallucination or something involved in that, often blindness or something. The way I've always responded to this sort of a thing is to say, okay, and I know you differ a little bit from how, like I say, Lycona or Habermas would do this. But the response I've always thought of would be to say, okay, well, that may be true. It may be true that Paul had something like that, but you're having to now posit multiple explanations for all these different pieces of data that we're looking at to build our case. When it's like someone's got a set of symptoms that seem to match COVID, but instead you say, well, maybe they don't have COVID. Maybe they have a headache over here and a fever over here and an upset stomach over here, when all of that could have been explained with one answer, right? So it's this explanatory scope sort of a thing. What's your reaction to that?
No, you're completely right, and I should have added that to my explanation there as well. One common mistake that people make on both sides, actually, of the theism-atheism divide is to evaluate each of the arguments individually in terms of their own merits. And when I say X is evidence for Y, what people hear is X is sufficient to conclude Y, which is not necessarily what I'm saying. Skeptics will very frequently examine, say, the cosmological argument for God's existence, find it to be inconclusive, move on to the fine-tuning argument, find it to be inconclusive, and so forth, without stopping to pause to consider whether the arguments taken in aggregate might be sufficient to justify your conclusion. And the same is true, I think, with my case for Christianity particularly, that even if each of my 6 different lines of argument are insufficient to justify Christian belief, I would argue that in aggregate, they render the case more or less conclusive. In fact, someone in the Q&A after the debate asked me about how does the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds justify belief in God? Why does it require that we postulate that God exists? And I said, it doesn't. It just moves the needle in that direction. I think that contributes some evidence to our broader cumulative argument that the nation of it, given God's covenants with the nation of Israel, it's highly predicted on the hypothesis that God of Israel exists, that the nation of Israel will survive despite the many attempts to stamp out the people of Israel. And when you look at all the different ordeals that the people of Israel have survived through, including the Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib, including the Babylonian exile, including the plot by Haman during the Persian Empire, including the Maccabean period, where there was a persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid tyrant, and of course the Roman siege, occupation and siege of Jerusalem, resulting ultimately in AD 70 in the dispersal of the Jewish people and the sacking of the city of Jerusalem, and then of course the Nazi Holocaust. And yet through all of those trials, the people of Israel have retained their national identity. And in 1948, the nation of Israel was reconstituted, and that is again somewhat surprising on the falsity of the hypothesis of the God of Israel, but it's exactly what you would expect on the hypothesis that the God of Israel exists. And so it's not conclusive and it's not sufficient, but it does move the needle in that direction, and so it contributes to a broader cumulative argument.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't have any more questions about this. I thought it was a particularly strong case, and I love the stuff that I don't thoroughly understand about genetic. I mean, you made what the point you're trying to make understandable, but I don't know all the science. So listening to you talk about it was really nice. I think this is a debate that I'm going to recommend to people, and tell them to watch. I think that this was good for the kingdom. And I think that's the best compliment I could get if I was talking to someone after a debate. So, Jonathan, anything else you want to say to the audience before we let you go? I want to encourage everyone to check out all the links that are below. Check out you need to be familiar with his ministry, Talk About Doubts, even if you don't think you need it, because you'll run into people that do need it. Anything else you want to say about any of this?
No, I think that's a great place to leave off. I'd highly encourage listeners to come check out talkaboutdoubts.com, and you can, if you have someone that you know that's struggling with doubts, or yourself, or if you're an ex-Christian and you're interested in exploring whether there's a way back to faith, then please do reach out to us. I will emphasize that we're not an informal debate club, so if you're just wanting to come on and do a debate with us, that's not really what we're about. But if you really would sincerely like to learn about the evidence for Christianity and sit down with an expert and talk one-on-one, then please do get in touch. We'd love to do something up. You can also find my personal website at jonathanmclatchie.com, and if you click on writing there, then you will find my blog where I write some of my more in-depth reflections on various topics relating to Christianity and apologetics.
And I'll put all those links down there, everything you mentioned and more. So thanks for being here, Jonathan. And we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.